Good afternoon. My name is Patricia O'Reilly, and on behalf of the Jesuits of Canada and our Communications Director, Jose Sanchez, I welcome you to our presentation by Father John O'Brien, Finding Your Way, Discerning the Will of God. Father O'Brien will speak for approximately 40 minutes, and then we'll follow with questions and answers. Please post your questions in the Q&A box on your screen. I'm going to ask Jose to talk to you about technical issues.
For this bit, I'll switch to French so that our French-speaking audience can choose the language that they prefer. Alors, pour choisir la langue de votre préférence, comme on l'a dit avant, si vous êtes sur un ordinateur, dans les commandes de votre session, cliquez sur le bouton Interprétation et après, cliquez sur la langue que vous souhaitez entendre. Si vous êtes sur un appareil mobile, dans les contrôles de votre session, appuyez sur le petit bouton avec trois petits points ou plus, et après, appuyez sur le bouton Interprétation de la langue. Finalement, appuyez sur la langue que vous souhaitez entendre. And another reminder, you can ask questions throughout the session by using the question and answer button at the bottom of the screen or the top of the screen, depending on the device that you're using. And questions will be answered, time permitting, towards the end of the session. And finally, another reminder that the recordings for all of the sessions and other resources, such as slides, and I believe Father John will be sharing a handout. All of those will be shared with participants and registrants by 5 days after today. Thank you, Pat.
It's my pleasure to introduce Father John O'Brien. He's a member of the Society of Jesus. Father John grew up in British Columbia and studied at the University of Ottawa and at the Gregorian University in Rome. He entered the Society in 2008. He earned a Master of Divinity and Licentiate in Sacred Theology from Regis College at the University of Toronto. He gives retreats to young adults across Canada, and he serves as the Vocation Director for the Jesuits of Canada. Father John, thank you for being with us this morning. Over to you.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to this talk. I'm, first of all, very grateful to be invited to give this talk on discerning the will of God, and would like to give a big thank you to the organizers of the conference and to all of you as well who have come to listen. My name is Father John O'Brien, and the talk I will give is on principles of Ignatian discernment that derive from the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius in ways that I hope will be applicable to your life and the discernments or decisions that you have to make or feel like you're facing. Whether those decisions be large vocational issues, am I called to marriage or am I called to some form of consecrated life, as the case may be, or maybe medium level discernments that are still important, such as, do I go to school? If so, what program or major should I take? Should I enter into a relationship with a certain person? Okay, so those are kind of medium level or even daily discernments too, can benefit from some of the principles I'm about to describe. Please keep in mind, most of these principles come from the space of discerning larger questions, but as I say, they can be utilized in various ways. So let's begin. Discerning the will of God is an art. It's also, or perhaps a science, but it's something that we benefit from when we have a bit of instruction, a bit of information about some of the time-tested means of hearing the will of God or the voice of God in our lives. Now, there's many ways and advices on making decisions in life of a self-help variety. But what I'm sharing today comes from the Ignatian tradition, and therefore it has a few prerequisites. If you're a person who is actually seeking God's will, then for these principles to work, you need some of the following conditions. Number one, you need to have an active prayer life. These all require prayer. You have to be primarily listening to God in your life. Okay. Secondly, you have to be seeking God's will. That's what this is about. Is it presumes that we believe in a benevolent creator who called us into life and who has intentionality for us in our lives. So he gives us a lot of freedom, to be sure, but God is also personally interested or vested in how we live our lives. Thirdly, we need a holy indifference to everything but God's will. So we need to be free from disordered attachments or just any attachments that we make into idols or anything that would hinder us from God's will. We have to be ready, in other words, to hear God's will and follow God's will. And then fourthly, these things can be too hard to do on our own, and it's really good to have data for our discernment. We need to be people who go out and ask questions and receive the information we need to make our decisions, and also to get the advice of other people, of God, get godly counsel, or talk to people who are wise and holy. If you have these four prerequisites, you're good to go, at least with regard to Ignatian discernment. So where does Ignatian discernment come from? It comes from the man, St. Ignatius, the founder of the Jesuits, also a man who had a very dramatic conversion. He was a soldier before he was a saint, and his own conversion story took place exactly 400 years ago on the walls of the Spanish town of Pamplona, where he was defending the city against the invasion of the French, until a cannonball hit him directly, and he fell. And after that, found himself recuperating for a long time. And he went from being a man who was focused and had oriented his life on pursuing self-glory, basically self-promotion, self-glorification, a life of ego. He had certain natural virtues, you might say. He was courageous, he was brave, but he was very much, you could say, egocentric. So he is finding himself in painful circumstances as his leg repairs itself. And as he lies there in his home castle, he reads books to pass the time. And there's not a lot of books, because books are just invented, but there are some. He begins with his preferred books, adventure stories, romance stories, which have always kindled his imagination. He would imagine himself in the position of these heroic protagonists doing great deeds for the reputation it would give him, and also to win the affection of all people, especially certain ladies. So he had a very vivid fantasy life, you might say. Well, he does this. He gets the feels from doing that. And then when those books run out, he asks, is there anything else to read? And they give him what's left, which is a life of Christ and a lives of the saints, kind of the medieval saints, St. Francis of Assisi, St. Dominic. And probably out of sheer boredom, he begins reading these. But something different happens. He notices that there's a difference in his interiority. In other words, in his inner life, he can feel the difference between what was the spike of feeling good about imagining himself doing all those exploits versus a different kind of feeling when he started to imagine himself doing the deeds that the saints did for God's glory. And he notices that it's a deeper feeling and it lasts longer. So he takes note of that. And this was the beginning of what for the rest of his life would become the development of the rules for discernment of spirits. Spirits being the inner movements that he believed would either came from God or the Holy Spirit or from the evil one, the enemy, or thirdly, could even be conjured up within his own self, have its origin in his own mind. So 3 sources of thoughts potentially, and how to discern between them. This would be the rules of discernment, rules meaning principles, guiding lights, lampposts to help us navigate our way forward in the interior life, the spiritual life, and as we're talking about today, the life of deciphering God's will, God's voice, and consequently God's intention for our lives. So you may have heard of the key terms, consolation or desolation, that define the varying spirits at work. And it's important to know what St. Ignatius means by these things, because they don't just mean good feelings or bad feelings. They tend to be determined by the state of your soul. I mean, if you're a unrepentant sinner, well, the evil spirit will be giving you feelings that are largely pleasant to keep you in the cycles that you're in. Whereas the good spirit might not feel all that great as your conscience and the innate call to holiness tries to shake you from the rut that you are in. So when we look at these definitions, we assume that you are a person who has holy desires and is actually going from good to better. You're trying to improve and grow. And if that's the case, then the good spirit is the giver of consolation and the evil spirit is the giver of desolation. And they will feel like this. These derive almost word for word from St. Ignatius, his own original text. So consolation is an interior movement that leaves me inflamed with love for God. It might also involve holy tears, okay, which we might call holy emotion, a sense of peace or of joy. And finally, any increase of faith, hope, or love, right? Those are the theological virtues that link us to God. So that's his description of consolation. So notice it's interior. You might be filled with love in a way that all your other loves are sort of subordinate to that primary love of God. You might find yourself experiencing deep emotion in your prayer, certainly peace, certainly joy, and any kind of spike or surge of faith, your trust in God, hope, as well as love. So these are the key terms that define consolation. You're probably thinking and noting that this is not something we can have or experience on demand. It's something that comes as a gift, as a grace. But when it happens, we know that it's happening. And that's a key signal that God is speaking. Desolation is essentially the opposite of all of those symptoms of consolation, right? It's still an interior movement, but it's one that has now left you in darkness, right? That feeling of interior darkness. Also disturbance, like just chaos, agitation, right? That's not from the good spirit. Compulsive attractiveness, or attraction to base things. What does that mean? That is, you find yourself almost compulsively drawn to the lower passions, what classically might be called our lower appetites and passions, in a way that seems to be overriding your will, overriding your better judgment. Okay, so what's going on there? Probably a form of desolation. Spiritual sloth. So that's, you just feel almost repelled by the idea of prayer and holy things. And also finally, sadness, right? Now, there is a good kind of sadness when there's an objective reason to be sad. Not all sadness is desolate. But this is heavy sadness or bitter sadness, a sadness that also maybe comes without a cause, or it's a little bit sudden. Okay, those are the ways to start looking out for what is genuine consolation or genuine desolation. Which brings us to a very key question, and all of this has to do with discernment. But in the meantime, it's like, well, if I'm experiencing consolation, maybe it happens when I've sat down to pray. Maybe I've gone to communion, received the Eucharist, Maybe it's just a moment walking in nature. I mean, there's so many ways God, who is so good and gracious, gives us consolation. But when you're aware of it, obviously it's there to be enjoyed, but God gives things for a reason too. So we should, in these times, says Saint Ignatius, learn to remember our consolations. Because if we have desolation in the future, one of the symptoms of desolation is that we forget we ever had intimacy with God. We forget we ever had consolation. And one of the deceptions is that it will feel like you've always had desolation. You've always been in desolation. God has always been distant. You've always felt sad. All of those aren't true. And so to go against that lie, we have to also have stored up, he says, our experiences of consolation. And one way to store up our experiences of consolation is to have a good spiritual journal, that we journal not just the struggles, even though the struggles are real, but also the high points, the lights, the graces, the consolations. What God is doing in your soul, the symptoms of a loving God. Okay, so we store them up for the future. Now things get interesting. What do we do if we're experiencing desolation? Well, because we want to get out of desolation. St. Ignatius advises, with some of those other rules, that this is not a time for spiritual weakness. But even if we're not feeling like it, increase our prayer, right? It's the only way. He also says add some suitable penance, because as Jesus says in the Gospels, some spirits are only cast out by prayer and fasting. There's power in our willpower, which decides to do some form of penance, and make regular examines. So take 5 or 10 minutes and try and see the sequence of events that may have led to desolation. Is there some discernible cause, whether it's a natural cause, whether it's a spiritual cause, whether it's just because you weren't getting enough sleep, or whether it is because maybe you are mad at God in a way that's unfair, or maybe you've been giving into temptations of some kind. Okay, examine in order to pull ourselves out of the desolation. St. Ignatius also advises patience. Patience, patience, patience. Do not be disturbed or distressed that you're in desolation. It's usually a passing storm. It's usually a spirit that will flee as soon as we turn our attention to it. And then there's a well-known rule known as, well, it's Rule 5, and it's to not make your major decisions. So the discernments that you're doing, that you're facing, the major choices that you're trying to make, if you're aware that you're in desolation, wait for a while. Wait until you're not in desolation, because it's not the right time or occasion to be making that decision. Why? Well, it's not the right time, not the right spirit. You're under the influence of the wrong sort of thing. So especially if you're making a decision that might change something that you had already discerned well in the past. So if you had made a good discernment before about a state of life, about maybe don't wait until, please wait until you're in a good space to make that change, if a change is indeed warranted. Now, use common sense here. Obviously, if you're in an abusive situation or something has gone terribly wrong, objectively, use common sense. And of course, then you can make a change. But these are spiritual principles. So it mainly has to do with our interior life. And all things being steady and equal, if you're mainly faced with the question of making a discernment about between goods, right? Maybe your current situation is good, but you're also facing another equally good or possibly better option. Okay, don't make that decision in desolation. And then a couple more things. The first is, it would be typical of desolation to have negative thoughts that you're not good enough for something, or you're not holy enough, You're not intelligent enough for God or any purposes that God might have in your life. Okay, basically any thought that says you can't. All right, those aren't from God. God believes in us and also promises to supply what we need to fulfill his will. It's the evil spirit who suggests that we can't. Okay, so just be alert to those sorts of thoughts as you discern inner thoughts. And then finally, rule 13, there's 14 rules, by the way, that can be explored. This is an important one, I believe. And this is, again, if in desolation, it's a remedy that advises us to not try and solve things by ourselves. That's a temptation, to deal with our desolation alone. St. Ignatius says there can be a great remedy in bringing, he calls it bringing it to the light, to talk about things with a spiritual person, because the enemy does not like the light, and the enemy is a coward and flees, essentially, is how we look at that. So please always, if you're in desolation, bring those things to the Lord through conversation with the holiest person you know. Maybe that's your grandmother, maybe that's a good friend, a mentor. Bringing things to the sacrament of confession is the bringing to the light par excellence that just, sticks the sword into desolation. So that's the principle there. This brings us back to discernment, though, and the question of how do I discern where to go, especially if we're looking at major discernments in our life, such as vocation. And St. Ignatius says that's a good question, and it's a question everyone asks in their lives at one point or another. And in his spiritual exercises, which is the retreat that he composed, the method of having deeper conversion and coming to attunement of the will of God, he begins it all by writing, "Why am I created?" It's a good starting point. It's a good starting point for any discernment, especially those of a higher magnitude. And this was the fruit of Ignatius's own mystical visions and life of prayer. But he saw deeply that all of God's creatures have been created with a purpose that can be distilled to praise, reverence, and service of God. And by this means to save your soul. Why praise? Why reverence? Why service? Well, he knew that these were the primary love languages. God is love. We're called from God to return to God in the time that's been given us on this earth. And eternity, which is a long time, will be characterized by this deep down vocation that we have. The scriptures are full of allusions to the heavenly court, or the great assembly of people who day and night chant the praises of God just because they've found their fulfillment in the beauty and the goodness and the truth that is God. And so praise is a love language. We even do that with each other, with the persons that we love. We praise them. So to become people of praise, how then am I called to find my access or my locus of praise, to form myself or to be formed into a person who has a facility of praising God? Reverence is because God is God, and reverence is actually necessary for relationship to happen, because the opposite of reverence is irreverence. And as we all know, even with human relationships, if you're truly in love, a mature and deep and abiding love between persons, those two persons will have a love characterized by reverence, we might say, for each other, respect, a sense of the dignity of the other. So where can I find dignity in my life? That is it, both for myself, but mainly in the way in which I will live, the way in which I will relate to God and to my neighbor. And then finally, service, because a simple theology of the body, look at our own embodiment, will tell us that we're made for action. We're made with hands and feet, designed to do things. So eventually what starts in the interior life will manifest in the exterior, will take form. So service is where we find our fulfillment as well. How do we serve God? That's the question. Praise, reverence, and service. So if this is true, then it follows that all the other things in the world are there to help us. Ignatius has a very positive view of creation and that God made everything good. And therefore, we're to know that all the possibilities, all the things in the world, whether they're relationships, other people, physical objects, material possessions, talents, all of these things have been given to us so that we can fulfill our purpose in life. And then just to finish that, from this it follows that you are to use things as much as they'll help you attain your end. That means your purpose. And also to rid yourself of them if they're preventing you from attaining it. So right here we have some discernment to do. We need to take stock of our lives and say, well, of all my possessions, all of my relationships, all of my talents, which are the ones that are helping me pursue the praise, reverence, and service of God? Which ones are actually holding me back? Obstacles. And that's point 4 here, that we should make ourselves indifferent to all the created things, insofar as it's left up to us to do so, and it's not forbidden. For example, we should not be indifferent to, well, like health, and we shouldn't be indifferent to service already. But we should desire things only if they're going to help us attain the end for which we're created. So, my dear friends, this foundation to discernment is a great consideration to make when you're doing discernments of practical options, okay? It certainly helped me when I was discerning my own vocation to be a Jesuit. I remember praying with all of these. You can pray with the 4 points and I remember thinking, yeah, well, what's the best way I can do that? Well, with the time that's been given to me. I needed to take stock of the positive things in my life, those talents, etc. But I also had to rid myself. You might call it conversion. I had to be purified a little bit of my own attachments that were not conducive towards the end for which I'm created. Well, Ignatius gets very concrete. He gets very specific about how you can do a good discernment. He was convinced that if you're a praying person seeking God's will, that there's actually 3, he doesn't call them 3 ways because they're not completely dependent on us. They come to us or they don't come to us. So he calls them times. And they kind of cover the gambit, the range of possibility. So let's look at these. I think these are very helpful. The first one is you might receive an unmistakable grace, as St. Paul and St. Matthew did in following Christ our Lord, which is to say, you might just receive the intuition, the light, or even a word, if you're praying with scripture, that is sufficiently compelling or convincing that it determines your discernment done. Because as we remember from the New Testament, Paul went from being a persecutor of Christians to being the great missionary and writer of the New Testament through an experience or a grace he received on the road to Damascus that turned him right around. It was so convincing. So sometimes we too can receive a compelling grace of this nature. Secondly, another time or mode that might come is if we spend a bit of time in prayer, in discernment, in getting the data, in receiving that godly counsel or getting that counsel. And over time, we experience the consolations and maybe even the desolations that we've looked at already, which over time will reveal a pattern. And the deep consolations will be associated with a certain path, a certain pathway or direction. And this reveals God's will, essentially. So St. Ignatius is convinced that if we pay attention to our interior life, eventually consolations will be consistent and point to something revealing of God's will for us. Okay, this can take a bit of time. Thirdly, well, what happens if I am not really experiencing much of consolation or desolation? And that's fine. Sometimes we have less of a dramatic interior life, and maybe we're more cerebral persons. And we're people of prayer, though, and so he says, if that's the case, when there's no experience of conflicting spirits, just calm, I use my reason to determine which option is best for the end goal of my life. I use my God-given reason. So Ignatius obviously is very pro-logos, pro-reason, that it's a God-given faculty to know what is true from what is false, or what is a greater priority over a lesser priority. So how might you do this? I'm going to expand upon this third mode right now. Although I do want to say first mode, second mode, and third mode, you might have a combination of all three. When I was discerning my vocation to be a Jesuit, I certainly had a first mode. That was the compelling grace. Okay, there was definitely a moment. I remember it very well. It was on a retreat, and it was an experience during a meditation, and it was so from God. It was so from not me, the follow me message, that I couldn't argue with it. I tried for a little bit, but then that tipped me into desolation. And so I went back to it, faced it, said yes, and was walking on the water with Jesus. You know, he had called me out of the boat. So that was a first mode, compelling grace thing. But it was in the context of a second mode of a long period of weighing the consolations and desolations, which themselves were starting to point towards consecrated life, in my case, and Jesuit life in particular. And thirdly, there were certainly times where I did the pros and the cons list. You know, I used my reason and thought, okay, well, what should I do with my life? What can I do with my life? What has God done for me? What can I do for God? What am I doing for Christ right now in my life? What should I do for him? And ended up with clarity there. But let's say you are really following or pursuing this third time or mode. It would go something like this. Number one, you just consider your choice. What's your choice? What are you discerning? Put it before your eyes. Number two, keep the why I am created your main criterion, okay? That's the principle of you're made for the praise, the reverence, and the service of God. So how does this decision today about what to study, about where to move, about who to marry, about, all of those things, how does it support or promote your pursuit of the praise, reverence, and service of God, primarily? Number three, ask God to move your will to accept what is more pleasing to him. Okay, things get real here, but it's like, if we're serious about discerning God's will, ask God to come in and, be present and help you to choose the choice that pleases him. Again, this presumes you're already in a relationship with God and that you love him and that you want to do what is pleasing to him. Number four, that this is when you consider the pros and the cons of choosing an option, and also the pros and the cons of not choosing the option. That ends up being 4 different lists, okay? The pros and the cons of yes, and the pros and the cons of no. And write down as many things as you can think, all the reasons you can think for that option and against that option. This is a prayer exercise. It might seem like a mental exercise, but do it prayerfully, and then reflecting, eliminate the reasons that aren't as important. I'm convinced that you will start to see, okay, this is more important, this is less important, this is more superficial, right? I'm not going to say under the pros, I really like poutine, and they serve great poutine Trois-Rivières. Therefore, I'm going to go to school in Trois-Rivières, Quebec. Okay, you did write that, but now you're looking at it and you're thinking, I probably shouldn't make my decision of what college or university to go to based on my belly, my appetite. And you cross a line through that. Okay, then finally, just pray about it and then decide. Eventually there comes a moment we have to decide based on all the lights we might have been given, the priority, the hierarchy of priorities that govern our decisions, and then make your decision and then offer it to God. Bring your decision to God. Okay, what more can you do? That's about it. So that's how that third mode would unroll. Finally, dear friends, St. Ignatius proposes a few thought experiments. Well, he doesn't call it that. That's what I call them, because I think that's what they are. That if you're really stuck, or if you just want to try something different, you can do. And sometimes these help pull us out of the cycles of thought. Maybe we get stuck in a circle of, but on the other hand, and these help us see things a little more objectively. That's what they're for. So the first one is, imagine you're at the end of your life. You can do it. We'll all get there one day. And looking back on your life, what decision today is going to give you like a great satisfaction then? Another thought experiment. Imagine you're before the Lord, giving an account of your life. One day we'll be there. So what decision now will give me joy and peace, before his face, in the sight of the Lord? And then thirdly, you can pretend that you are not you, and that there's someone else who is pretty much identical to you, who is facing the same discernment. Now you're in the role of the counselor. What advice would you give them? Okay, so these thought experiments might help shed light for you on your own discernment. Finally, I just want to say, lest any of this causes anxiety, remember the other foundation, which is that God created you in his image and likeness. And that's not just a carbon copy of something. That is as a creature who is beautiful. There was a Jewish rabbi who said, if all the books of the scriptures are holy, the Song of Songs is the Holy of Holies. Why did he say that? Well, because it's the presupposition of all of Revelation. And it's that God loves us tenderly and passionately and sees us as beautiful in his sight. Secondly, we're so beloved by God, right? And thirdly, God has blessed us already by giving us life, breath, being, calling us out of our whatever life we're in right now into new and wonderful horizons that await. So if you remember this, we know that we should not fear God's will in our lives, and we should be free to follow it with the confidence that we are sons and daughters, well loved by our Father in heaven. Finally, I wouldn't be a good vocation director for the Jesuits of Canada if I didn't also say to any of you, if there's anyone out there who is thinking of a possible Jesuit vocation, you can go exploring at beajesuit.org, êtrejesuite.org, and just have a look around. And for anyone else out there who is discerning a vocation, not to be afraid of God's will and to be bold, do things courageously for God, because he is truly not outdone in his own generosity and return. So finally, if any of these tools of discernment have been useful to you, you think they might be helpful, we're going to put in the chat and make available an ebook that kind of summarizes these things, a PDF of these basic principles called The 6 Daily Habits of Staying Spiritually Resilient, with a primer on Ignatian discernment at the end of it. So thank you for your kind attention today. And may God bless you and keep you, and may all your discernments between goods seek the greater good at all times, and may God be with you and at your side. Thank you.
A lot of questions have come in about your presentation, and so I'm going to get into them right away. First of all, what does magus mean?
What does magus mean?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, great question. Magus is a term you will encounter frequently in Jesuit circles, Jesuit schools, retreat centers, and it does come in part from the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, but also from the Jesuit constitutions. And it's a Latin word it means greater. It's a comparative adjective, the greater, and it usually is in the context of this idea that we're called to promote the greater glory of God, which as Saint Irenaeus said, the glory of God is his creatures fully alive, man fully alive, and the life of man is the vision of God. That's the second half of that phrase. So God's glory happens when we live in the radiance of God's glory. So the more we seek out God in our lives, the more we are living the magus, as we might say, living for God's glory. But that's also a personal discernment, is how do I live for God's glory, the greater glory, the expansion of God's glory, and the bringing it about in the world.
Can you speak about God allowing times of consolation?
Well, God is the God of consolation. He loves to bestow consolation on us, but it is through his sovereignty, through the mysterious, decisions and personhood of God. So it's not that God allows it. It's like God actually wants to be lavish with it, and have us live as much in consolation as possible. So on our part, we're just called to discern, did God just give me a really big gift of consolation? Was that a surge of consolation? And so in the context of discernment, if that is so, that's an invitation to consider, what was that consolation associated with? Is there something there that God is trying to speak to me?
Define holy imaginings. Are they concrete spiritual experiences, example, communicating with the Holy Spirit, or are they internal, example, a personal rumination of past spiritual experience?
Okay, thank you. So define holy imaginings. Yeah, I think what you've touched on there, both things, imagining your past experiences, but then also imagining holy things. Let's say images from Scripture, the life and person of Jesus Christ and the Gospels. All of that is legitimate content of holy imaginings. And I say that because both of those things are done when you do the Ignatian retreat, the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. So this is a good reminder for me to say here that all these 14 principles or rules of discernment that we've touched on, we didn't look at all of them, but we looked at the key ones. Some of the key ones are found within the context, and context is everything, of the spiritual exercises. They're basically written for people who are on retreat doing holy imaginings. Now we're extracting them and applying them a little bit more to daily life. That's what we're doing, because they seem pretty good. But it's good to remember that their home is a context of prayer, and the kind of prayer that involves holy imaginings. Reflecting on one's past, reflecting on one's present, reflecting on one's future, all in the light of the criterion for our lives as Christians, which is Christ. Thank you.
Do you think many of the saints lived with frequent times of desolation or feelings of absence of God? Thomas Merton, St. Paul, Mother Teresa.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I do. I mean, it's attested to in the writings of the saints that they went through periods of dryness, periods of darkness, periods of not knowing the will of God in their lives. And these were periods of tremendous suffering for them. There's no question. So to that, it brings up another question, which is why? Why did God allow that in their lives? Weren't they saints? Weren't they the friends of God? And it could cause confusion on our part. Like, is God sometimes like the ancient pagan gods? Are the gods capricious? Is our God capricious? Does he allow us to be led through darkness? What's going on? Well, the tradition of the church, the spiritual tradition, is that God does normally not intend spiritual darkness for us. If it happens, normally that's usually and probably on us. Like, there's probably the main invitation for us is to do examination, really, and say, well, gosh, how did I end up in spiritual desolation? We're not talking about, let's say, clinical depression or feeling desolate due to observable external causes that we can easily make a cause and effect relationship to. No, we're talking about spiritual, where God seems absent, faith, hope, and love barely existent. Okay. Many in the spiritual world will quickly latch on to the term a dark night experience. Am I having a dark night of the soul? Because that goes back to John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila. Therese of Lisieux seems to have experienced a long period of what we might call desolation. Mother Teresa wrote her book, Come Be My Light, in which she shared that she had gone through many years of this seeming absence of God. And so I would be careful to title your own experience of this as a dark night of the soul, because if you really get into what a dark night of the soul is, it's pretty bad. And it's in Ignatian spirituality, it's not what God intends for us. Can they happen as such, as described in the Carmelite tradition? Well, yeah, they can, but I think they're rare. They seem to be a Paschal mystery experience that only some of God's biggest saints can go through. It's like a purification of a purification. It's like some ultimate, their faith hangs on by just the barest of threads, they will say. And they all seem to be Carmelites. And named Teresa, most of them. So I would say in the regular scheme of things, as Christian men and women, we should not ascribe or fear long periods of desolation as coming from God. If we feel like we've had long periods of dryness or desolation, in the Ignatian way, it's more an invitation to look inward, do retreats, obtain the help of a spiritual director or guide, and just start seeing where some of the seeds there are. And that's a reliable pathway. God is the God of consolation.
When discerning about a decision in life, how long would you have to stay in discernment before actually making a decision?
Oh, okay. That's a good question too. And it's very personalized. Like I've seen it range from that first mode discernment. Someone gets a powerful grace, and that's the basis of their discernment right there. Others spend years. For my own self, it took for my vocation to consecrated life, it took me 2 years of concentrated discernment in a program and in a place where I could grow. I had to rid myself of those attachments we looked at earlier, and I had to just see where the consolations were, the real consolations, not my own superficial ones. So it probably depends a bit on the gravity of the discernment, the importance of what you're discerning. Probably the bigger it is, you might need to take a little more time. If it's those medium level ones, or even the micro discernments of daily life, they require less time. They shouldn't require a lot of time. And so it varies by person and circumstance, I would say. That's probably the best I can do to answer that question.
There are some changes that happen not some much out of discernment, but forced by life events, and give us not much time to wait for consolation. It is difficult to believe that this is God's will. Whatever decisions seem to be, excuse me, how do I reconcile this?
Yeah. Okay. So if I understand your question correctly, there's life circumstances that may come about that are not of God. They're desolating. Is I think what you're saying. Hard to know that it's the will of God, and I would agree. I mean, the cross might be part of our life as Christians. We followed the Lord all the way, but the cross is a spirit, like seen as such. It's a spiritual reality. A lot of what we call desolating experiences are the effects, not of God's will, but of its contrary, of God's not will, of sin in the world, the brokenness of our world, the original sin effect that permeates our given reality, other people, the structures of sin. I mean, all of those ways in which we look at it are the conditions that create desolation, what we might call desolation, but here I'd say, careful, it might not be the spiritual desolation we're talking about here, but just suffering in life. And I think my general response to that would be careful to ascribe that to God. God in the scriptures shows himself as the one who yearns for our flourishing, for our well-being, for our happiness and our peace, and in this life just as much as for eternity. So I agree. It's hard to believe that those would come from God too. Yeah. God bless you.
Can one follow the exercises of Saint Ignatius, a 30-day retreat at any age?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that. You absolutely can. You should probably be over 18 or something, but you're not too old. Ignatius was known to give the spiritual exercises retreat to people of different ages. If you're already in a vocation, though, let's say, so you're not doing it to do a major life decision or a vocational decision, you can still do the spiritual exercises, or you can still do some form of an Ignatian retreat for whatever benefit you're looking for in your Christian life, your vocation as such. And Ignatius has a term for it. He says a reform of life is one motive for doing that. You want to reform your life. And another way he says it is to love him more nearly, follow him more dearly. And how does the Day by Day song from Godspell go? Godspell took that song from the spiritual exercises. In other words, to grow in our intimacy with God. Those are legitimate reasons to do an Ignatian retreat. Yeah. And if you can't go away to a retreat center for 30 days for the full version of it, there are ways to do it in everyday life with a spiritual director, with a guide, but little less prayer per day, but spread out over several months.
In discerning God's will, there is at least one main event that causes the faithful to be converted. How does a person recognize this event before repenting towards God?
Okay, like a pivotal or seminal moment of like Saul being, on the road to Damascus, something like that, in which it's where one turns from the old you to the new you, and you embark on a life of more intentional discipleship. Yeah, I think you're right. I would just offer a caution, first of all, how do you know? I think like if you fall in, how do I know if I'm in love versus infatuated with someone by analogy? Well, when you're in love, you just know. How do everyone's got their conversion stories. But here's my just a qualification there. Not everyone does, actually. Some of us are cradle Catholics, let's say, but maybe we can point back to a time where we were more culturally so, but then we had an experience of Christ, and it was nonetheless transformative. Again, I will just say, when it happens. But there are Christians who maybe don't have the drama, the dramatic one moment is when it happened kind of experience. And I think that's okay too. I mean, sometimes we're all walking on pilgrimage towards God. And some people have these like giant pushes that causes them to sprint, and others are the slow pace throughout your life. You've attempted to grow in holiness and in faith, and so it's okay not to have a dramatic conversion story as well.
What is the role of gospel consolation in discernment? Are there specific scriptures you find particularly helpful?
Yeah. Consolation in the Gospels that I find helpful. It can happen with any contemplation of a gospel scene where Jesus Christ is present and has captured your ear or your eye. That's consoling and compelling. For me personally, I'll share it was the gospel scene when Jesus is walking on the water, and the disciples are in the boat, and a storm comes. And I've meditated on that before. It was one of those moments for me with my vocation as well. Get out of the boat. Get out of the boat. So the consolation was a bit of a hard consolation at first. It's a little bit scary. Get out of your comfort zone. But I sort of did, and found myself doing what was the impossible, walking on water. Eyes fixed on Christ, you can do anything. If your eyes look down, you'll find yourself in the waters of desolation. So that's a gospel I find linked to consolation quite a bit. There's many others. We all may have our favorites. There's beautiful scenes of Jesus walking on the shore. There's scenes of Jesus with his friends, Martha and Mary and Lazarus. There's the resurrection scenes, his dialogue with poor old Peter and John. From the whole Bible for consolation, I will point you again just to that slide that said we always have to remember that in God's sight we are beautiful and beloved and blessed. And there's passages, Song of Songs 4:1, the first letter of St. John, chapter 4, verse 10, and Ephesians 1:3, and there's many more. So good luck. God bless. Go find the consolation. It permeates the Holy Scriptures, which is God's love letter to humanity.
Father, thank you for this enlightening presentation. After praying and completing the discernment exercises, if your purpose is still somewhat unclear, should you simply follow what moves you, hoping it doesn't come from your ego, in the hopes that your God-given goal will reveal itself over time?
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. I would say if you're doing these exercises, you shouldn't be doing them alone. Like that is really the counsel of the church and of Ignatius's own spirituality, is that you would hopefully be doing it with a guide who can help. It's mainly happening to you. As St. Ignatius says, the creator is perfectly capable of speaking to the creature. So that's another premise to all of this. God speaks. So you should be receiving data in that way. And then you're making decisions, and sometimes we need a little help to cross over the threshold into action. In my vocations world, it's like I meet with discerners a fair bit, and there usually comes a time where they've received sufficient clarity, but they might need a little help just getting over the bump into, like, things get real, right? When you have to take action and maybe make a phone call or reach out to a vocation director, as the case may be. But your question is, if you're maybe you lack sufficient clarity, what do you do? Well, I would just remember that God still calls us to his will within the parameters of faith. we don't receive, skywriting messages up in the air. It's hard to describe a little bit, but God's will are still within the dynamic of faith. So God has asked us to follow, but in a way that still requires faith. It still requires stepping out. There's that phrase in the Gospels I love, your word, O Lord, is a lamp to my feet. So we think about that. It's illuminating just the next step. It's not a spotlight shining 10 miles down the road where you can see the rest of your life laid out for you. But God asks us just to go step by step in faith. So if a time has come for you to make a decision, sometimes the time comes, you can just make the decision in a provisional way based upon the lights that you've received. And then if it's an important enough decision, there's going to be checks and balances. There's also going to be objective circumstances that will also feed into the overall picture of God's will. I sometimes get people who come to me and say, I have a vocation to be a Jesuit, and they tell me that. And I have to say, I respect the subjective spiritual experience that you've had right now, but that experience will come into dialogue with the historical experience, with the wisdom of the Society of Jesus, of the Jesuits right now. And that's going to be a more objective interplay. So what I'm saying is you could begin exploring, take a few steps in a certain direction and see if they're confirmed or not. Okay. So sometimes to break out of our ruts, we just need to try something, right? We need to just go for it. And then St. Ignatius also says, and I'll finish my response with this. He says, sometimes God's will is revealed by practical circumstances. That's a helpful one sometimes. Ignatius doesn't over spiritualize God's will either, but says sometimes it's the old classic phrase, if God closes a door, he opens a new one, or see which windows open. But it's these practical circumstances that are indicative. Sometimes they're sufficient to indicate for us the road ahead.
What if you feel called to do something good and you do it well, but seemingly jealousy and politics urges someone to use your method and ideas to exclude you? They tell you that you should do small things to earn to do bigger things. Until then, you can advise them. When do you fight this, or do you accept this opposition as God telling you to do something else?
Okay, I sense there's a personal context there, particular situation. So I'm a bit hesitant to advise anything really there, other than get advice about the particularities of the situation. What are the dynamics going on in the group or in the place where you're working or using your talents? Why are they saying the things they're saying? Yeah, but it's a good question. It's like, is there a time to be bold and prophetic, maybe, or is it a time to say that's actually a door closing, and therefore it might be a sign that, because Jesus also says, if they, like about disciples going from town to town, if they do not receive you, then shake the dust from your sandals and keep moving, right? Move on to the place where your talents or words will be received. So maybe that's a good passage from the gospel to keep in mind for your situation.
What if, after discerning the name of election, circumstances divert from the direction that was intended, like illness?
Yeah, that's right. Good question. Yeah, you make a great discernment, you make a great election or choice for a particular path, whether that's a big meta vocation or it's something you were going to do for a year or two. Circumstances can change, and they can affect how the discerned pathway unrolls for you. We know that from history, that there's a dramatic nature to the unfolding of human affairs. And so things can change, and they might require you to kind of go back to the drawing board, as it were. This maybe also is asking the question, does God ever have a plan B or a plan C? Like, what happens if I didn't make a great decision or discernment for the bigger questions back in the day? What if I messed it up? What if it didn't work out the way I wanted? And my short answer to that is God may have had a preferential will for all of us, like a preferred will, what we might call a vocation. And that's good, because it means God had a plan, is close to us. And but then it changed. God does not leave us orphaned in this life. And so, of course, he has a plan B, and of course, he has a plan C. So God will not abandon us in life, and his will can be rediscerned. But obviously, you have to take into account the gravity of commitments made already. So if someone's in a marriage, for example, and things just really aren't working out in the marriage, it might not necessarily be an indication that you should rediscern being married. It might be an invitation to work out the problems in your marriage. Same with religious life, same thing. So, okay, anyway, enough said. Thank you for the question.
We have time for one more question.
Mm-hmm.
Is there danger in doing this process on your own without the help of someone? It is often difficult to find someone you can trust.
Yeah, fair enough. It is sometimes hard to find, like, say, a good spiritual director, if that's what you're looking for, or counselor. I would say if you're doing the more serious the discernment, probably the more important it is to have a spiritual director or guide. There are ways to do it. Most of the heavy lifting by yourself, though. The most of the discerning is on you and I to do as discerners. And there are ways you can do it in everyday life too, as I said earlier. And one of the resources in this PDF handout is actually a list of books, mostly written by Jesuits, about how to do the spiritual exercises in everyday life from home over varying amounts of time. But the general rule of thumb is it's pretty important to have someone who can provide that objectivity, be that objective mirror to all the subjective experience that you're having in your thought and in your prayer, and together try and reach a clarity about your decision.
Father O'Brien, thank you for your engaging and reflective presentation. You've given us some tools for Ignatian reflection, which will lay a foundation for us to discern the will of God in our own lives. Thanks also to Jose and Fanny and our translators, Patricia and Isabella. And most of all, thanks to the audience for being with us today. Our next session is at 2:30, where Father Scott Lewis will present on Ignatian meditation. Thank you.
And one last
Jose?
thing. Sorry, Father John. One last thing. I remember, as we have said before, that the recordings for all sessions, slides, and the handout that Father John prepared and we shared in the chat, all of that will be shared with you by 5 business days, 5 working days after today. And then the last thing is to invite you to the meditation with Father Scott Lewis, which is coming up in about 20 minutes.
Thank you, everyone. Merci à tous. Merci à Patricia et Isabella pour l'interprétation. OK, bonne journée.
Thank you.